Hello and welcome to something of a Watching Brief special. Yesterday afternoon, we recorded an interview with Dr. Bill Farley, and he indulged us for a little while. And after that, we simply kept him hostage, discussing discussing all manner of things, ranging from the TV series Bonekickers. Yeah, there's one for you. Check out the links below to if you don't know what I'm talking about there. Through to, more pertinently, the publication of a paper recently that appeared to be a moment of vindication for Graham Hancock in describing as the paper title says, a pyramid structure built by human hands, seemingly in Gunung Padang in Indonesia. This is an interesting topic. It was first introduced as an idea, specifically this evidence, carbon dating and geological forms of dating in the TV series on Netflix, Ancient Apocalypse. And so in some ways it isn't new information, but it is formal publication of that information. And Bill, over on his YouTube channel, Archaeology Tube, has actually brought his criticism to bear on that paper in terms of the content and the quality of the publication, and we're about to do the same in this conversation as well. So enjoy, see what you think, and comment below. I'm intrigued to see where this conversation goes, because I think it's really important actually to, if people want to present radical new ideas within any academic pursuit, then it has to be subject to radical new evidence, and that evidence has to be presented in a way which is forthright, easy to understand, and actually crucially is coming to the right conclusions based on the evidence as presented. So
I think there's another point to make as well, which is that again, see what you think when you've watched the chat, but this is arguably a case whereby some research has appeared in an archaeological journal of record, not because of a primarily archaeological project, but because of a book and particularly of a TV series by a put kindly, a fringe author.
With that in mind, here is how the conversation went.
We are joined by friend of the Watching Brief, Bill Farley. And the reason we've asked Bill back on is to talk about a recent controversial paper, which Bill has been fairly prominent in responding to, both on, what I still call Twitter, ex-Twitter, whatever you want to call it these days, but also particularly on a video on the YouTube platform, which is to give it its full title, Geoarchaeological Prospecting of Gunung Padang Buried Prehistoric Pyramid in West Java, Indonesia. It was published by Wiley. It comes from the peer-reviewed journal Archaeological Prospection, so a respectable, recognized journal of record, but it's proved incredibly controversial because it's appears to have made claims about the famous Gunung Padang pyramid, which go against generally accepted archaeological evidence, but appears to align with the views of the, for want of a better word, pseudo-archaeologist, or at least pseudo-historical writer Graham Hancock. Those of you that watched the Netflix series Ancient Apocalypse, which premiered just about a year ago, in fact, will remember that Graham Hancock filmed on location at Gunung Padang and made various claims about it being an ancient pyramid and predating its conventional dating by something like 10,000 years.
Well, it's interesting that even in your introduction there, Andy, you fell into the trap of referring to it as a pyramid. It's a geological formation upon which people have been living, as far as we can tell. But in that sense, I mean, Bill, do you have a sense of To what extent is this actually new anyway? Because even in that show, he had a local geologist making claims about carbon dating and sampling, and we talked about this in a previous episode. We'll link to it below. And I think we literally talked about it with you as well. Is this actually new, or is this just a formal expression of the stuff that he was drawing on in that series?
I think, if my understanding of it is correct, that this is essentially the journal article version of what he was drawing on in the series. And in fact, mentioning Graham Hancock, if we skip all the way to the end and you get to the acknowledgments, he's referenced in the acknowledgments as having proofread the paper. So, so Hancock is sort of integral to this paper in some degree. And so it was interesting and maybe a little bit ironic that a lot of people were claiming, oh, this is what finally is going to show that Hancock was correct. He's redeemed by this. When I think you're right. I think pretty much everything they say in this paper shows up in that episode of Ancient Apocalypse to a certain extent. And you mentioned the falling into the trap of calling it a pyramid. It's in the title of the article, so they and I think that's indicative of my biggest.
That's my excuse.
That really indicates my problems with the paper, which is that it's way out ahead of its skis in making a lot of interpretations and claims that are simply not supported by the evidence, to the point where they're putting it right in the title that this is what it is. But that's perhaps getting ahead of ourselves a little bit. So no, I don't think any of this is new, but this is I'm sure something I'll talk about a bit as we chat is the kind of journal article-ness of this, right? This being in a peer-reviewed journal, as you said, this is a respected journal. It's peer-reviewed, although the general public, I think, sometimes has a misconception about what peer review is and what it really means. And just because something's peer-reviewed, of course, doesn't necessarily mean it's good or right, as we all know. And lots of people know that, but also lots of people don't, or they maybe intentionally ignore that fact. But this is you would expect a certain level of professionalism and scientific rigor in a paper in a journal like this, and it's just not there. And before we started, we were talking about there was almost immediately afterwards a follow-up in the same journal to this by a couple of really good scholars that's quite critical of exactly the kind of things that show up in this. I'm sure we'll get a chance to talk about that too. So no, I don't think anything new under the sun here.
No.
The second article that Bill's just referred to is called Saying What We Mean, Meaning What We Say, Managing Miscommunication in Archaeological Prospection. It's, again, published in the same journal, Archaeological Prospection, teeth in, by the publisher Wiley. It's by William T.D. Wadsworth, Stephanie Halmhofer, and Keisha Supernan, and we will talk about it later because I think it expands on what we're about to talk about in terms of the Gunung Padang.
But it's also worthwhile saying that one of the great things is this is open access. Both of them are open access articles. So, we mentioned professionalism. This is actually good practice, I think, to actually have your research out there and to be observable and to be open to critique. So, good on them in that sense.
And in fact, if I could make a quick point there as well, it's possibly the first time he's mentioned in the acknowledgements, is possibly the first time Graham Hancock's actually been peer reviewed. But by being open access like this, there is now a public peer review going on in general terms, which
does Graham Hancock consider anyone who has peer reviewed this to be his peer?
Well, I mean, obviously, good question. I suspect he'd regard us as representatives of big archaeology.
Yeah,
but,
exactly.
Anyway, Bill, what exactly have they claimed, and what's your response to what they've claimed?
So I as you were saying, I originally sort of saw this paper pop up and saw some people starting to critique it, and it was being supported by some supposed critics on places like Twitter who were saying, "Oh, this is the thing that's going to redeem Graham Hancock." So of course I was instantly interested. So I went and grabbed the paper and read it, and was shocked that it didn't seem to redeem Graham Hancock at all. So I made a YouTube video about it, and I'm just looking at like my index from that because that's sort of the things that were in there. And so the paper is making a claim that and I should be upfront that this is way outside my expertise area in the sense that I do the archaeology of New England in like the 17th and 18th century. I'm a historical archaeologist. The reason why I responded to this is because for some reason that I haven't yet discerned, people seem to be interested in the things that I say. And I could come at it just from a general purpose archaeologist who can kind of look at these things and has enough training to read these papers and see the red flags and to sort of point them out. But there's a lot of stuff in this journal that goes beyond my level of expertise, and I've really been relying on others, especially the geology and the geoarchaeology stuff, which I know Andy is going to bring a little expertise to us for in a few minutes. But the paper makes a claim that there is a intentionally buried pyramid beneath this site in Indonesia that is dated to something like 16 to 24,000 years ago, which is an extraordinarily long time ago. And if you're not sort of embroiled in archaeology and a lot of numbers get thrown around, that's a really long time ago. So that's in the Pleistocene. That's during the last ice age. It's of the same time period that Graham Hancock is talking about in his show, quite conveniently, in the time period when this great Atlantean global civilization was supposed to be kicking around and doing things like building pyramids. So seems like lovely evidence for that. But the paper really relies on geoarchaeological prospecting techniques. That's why it seems like a good fit for this journal in some ways to come up with this interpretation that underneath this real site in Indonesia that's much, much less old than that by at least 10, 15,000 years is another site, a buried pyramid. And they found this using a combination of things like ground penetrating radar and geological coring, and they make the claim on my main criticism of it is I don't think they really have any evidence for that at all. So they do a pretty good job of going through their methods and describing their methods, showing how the site was cored. And geologists and geoarchaeologists that I've been following have pointed out some real flaws in their methods there. Their cores look really bad. They're very messy. They're very, very sort of unprofessional, not following best practices. So we might have reason to doubt their geological prospecting techniques altogether. But even if they are real, they make one particularly huge leap of logic, which is they took some soil cores down into these volcanic void spaces because the site is on top of a sort of volcanic geological setting, and geologists and volcanologists have been pointing out that these are perfectly normal, natural geological features in most cases, but they wanted to test that to see if there was anything down there. And you know what? That's great. That's okay. Hypothesis. Maybe there's an earlier cultural feature down in these volcanic void spaces. Go ahead and test it. So the way they chose to test that was by putting these little geological cores down into them, and they pulled some soil up, and some of those soils were carbon rich. They were organic rich, so they could be dated using radiocarbon dating, and they dated those, and the dates they were sent to Beta Analytic, which is the kind of radiocarbon lab of choice in the U.S. at least. It's a legitimate place to do it. So I don't think there's anything wrong with the radiocarbon dates. Those dates come back to this 16 to 24,000 year old date range. They come back really, really old. And so they say, there you go. There's our proof that we've got our buried pyramid here, and it's 16 to 24,000 years old. Except there's one bit of evidence lacking, which is the pyramid. Where is this? There's no cultural material at all associated with these soil cores. They stuck a soil core down into the ground, got dates from it, and claimed that because the dates were old, that's how old the site was. But you also need to, as we know as archaeologists, prove an anthropogenic source of those dates. So the dates themselves have to come from artifacts, which these clearly did not. Or if they're coming from geological soils, they need to be closely spatially affiliated with cultural artifacts or features or something that would speak to that. Now, their claim is that they can see those features in things like the GPR surveys. No, we've got this reflection. Yeah, so that's their claim, right? Their counterclaim is so all the archaeologists are, well, where's the artifacts? Where's the evidence that they sculpted this pyramid and then buried it? You can see that sort of thing in geology. You can see that sort of thing if you excavate and screen and soil, but they have none of that stuff. So they say, well, that's what you can see in the remote sensing data. But everybody I know who knows anything about remote sensing has said. And what I know about remote sensing is that's not how remote sensing works. Remote sensing, you get you get coded information when you do like a GPR survey. You get this information that shows something is there. You get a reflection of something hard, maybe, but you have to ground truth that, right? You have to go and check and find out what that is in most cases, except in really, like maybe a counterexample might be if you're doing a GPR survey of like a cemetery, right? You can see the lined up burial shafts, right, in the GPR. You don't necessarily have to ground truth those. You can tell what they are. But in most cases, you're just getting reflections and you go, and it's evidence that you might want to further follow up with excavation. And they didn't do that at all here. Their one artifact that they claim is probably not an artifact, because most people seem to agree that it might be it looks like a rock. I think it's a neat, kind of interesting rock, but I think it's just a rock. So they've made a huge claim here that would have humongous impacts of our understanding of this part of the world and what's going on at this time period. But they just do not have the evidence to support it, or maybe even any evidence.
Can I illustrate that perhaps for our audience with one of the criticisms that I've certainly seen of this particular paper and the evidence that the authors cite, and I would just say that there's the old joke about a camel is a horse designed by committee, and this paper has over 10 authors credited at the start. Now, how much input each of those had into the writing is obviously we don't know. And it has passed peer review in a respected journal. But for example, one of the criticisms I've certainly seen is that they talk about charcoal, and they make an assumption that charcoal, which obviously can be carbon dated, it's organic, is from cultural occupation. But other people point out, now, wait a minute, this is a volcanic region. You get forest fires. There's absolutely no proof whatsoever that this is cultural, from a hearth, say, or a kiln or whatever. It's classic. I say A is true, so therefore, if A is true, B must be true. It's that kind of logic.
I think so. I think there's a really big logical leap there that is just a fundamental no-no in archaeology, which is you preassume the presence of charcoal that dates to a certain age does not preassume the presence of an archaeological site at that age, because, like you said, there are lots of perfectly natural geological explanations for how charcoal can get into soils, far more than there are cultural explanations, frankly. Like you said, a forest fire, anything, right? They're just organic, rich soils that can happen in many, many different ways, most of which do not involve human activity at all. And that seems to be what they've got here. But they've also taken these just tiny, tiny little geological samples. They haven't really done any excavation. So if they really want to prove this, they would need to go and do some excavation and show something.
But there's a risk there, isn't there? The moment that if they were to open up the site, they could completely destroy their premise. And it's so much more tempting to have we think there's definitely something down there. And that's such a weird sentence, I know, but that's the whole point, isn't it? We think there's definitely something there. And so this idea of the limitations of remote sensing and geophysical prospection, really the issue is whether or not you can identify an occupation layer specifically. It's not even whether or not something necessarily is actually artifactual, because a coin, for example, could fall down a crack and make its way down over the course of hundreds of years to anywhere in a porous geological structure. What you need is to know where that coin is, how it got there, and how it relates possibly to some sort of occupation layer. Now, I know of very busy reflections and results from GPR surveys, ground penetrating radar, where people have said, oh yeah, there's definitely going to be a grave here, and it's actually a cut for a drainage pipe that later on has been retrieved by the farmer, or in other cases. I mean, for example, on Time Team, I can't help but think of a few instances where they're like, we absolutely we're going to land on, X structure. We're going to land on the cloister of a monastic center here. And they end up not really knowing what the hell they're looking at, because when the moment they bring up the topsoil, what looks like right angles on the survey actually turns out to be maybe a combination of plowing activity and geological movement and so on and so forth. you can't just look at a geophysical survey and guarantee that you know what you're seeing. You can, as you say, there's noise and feedback for if there's a whole row of disturbances. It could be something like a graveyard, but just getting samples from voids in what we know is a geologically active area it just doesn't pass muster. Now, I don't know if Andy wants to talk about another case study at this point, but I would like to ask the question: has the damage been done? I mean, I posited a couple of days ago on social media that actually I think it has been done, because in 10 years' time you're going to get people sort of going, "Oh yeah, wasn't there that paper about a 20,000-year-old pyramid?" It's out there, and before, never mind trousers, people are still putting their underwear on, to get out the door and chase after it. Is this the risk of not just pseudo-archaeology, but possibly also actually the publishing model within academia? The rush to get your data out the door is that you can sometimes enable narratives that just warrant a bit more attention and care.
I do think that there is a lot to consider here as it relates to the peer review model and to journals in a lot of ways. And I also agree with you, in some ways, like Michael Shermer, who was my original person I was criticizing, talking about Hancock being vindicated. He's actually right? Because the idea of getting this information in a peer reviewed journal does vindicate him to a great number of people. And we are going to be hearing that for years. Oh, you said that couldn't happen, but look, this got through peer review. And there's a fundamental lack of understanding of how peer review works and the problems with peer review. Peer review has real problems right now. Not philosophically, right? Philosophically, it's a great idea, but it relies on a couple of things. It relies on that authors are acting in good faith, which I'm not sure it happened in this case, right? So if authors are, you can sneak something through a peer review if you're sneaky about it, right? And the peer reviewers might not realize that's what you're doing, and they think they're reviewing something in good faith, and maybe they let it through.
Now, obviously, there's lots of pressure on academics, both hardworking, legitimate, young and old, and also people who are trying to chance their arm to try and find a way to get published. Citations are one of the metrics that, especially, for example, in the US system, academics definitely have to have. And you can see why that drives all sorts of stuff coming at these sluice gates that are essentially the journals of the day and that allow information to be disseminated to other people. But I also sort of can't help but wonder in this case, when it comes to the notion of peer and pressure, is there any indication that this is similar to what we've seen happen in and around the Bosnian pyramids, where local, possibly even national government has actually an interest in this being seen as legit? The way that it was filmed in the Ancient Apocalypse series certainly seemed to have been no problem at all getting local geologists involved. And in the case of, I'm not literally making accusations here, I'm asking questions, in so much as in the case of the Bosnian situation, there was, I think there still is, essentially a national park dedicated to a pseudo-archaeological notion. Is that, do we know if there's an angle there that's kind of maybe greased some of the wheels here?
There are murmurings that this is the case, and what I keep hearing, and interestingly, people are really not willing to talk about this so much. But the word is that this is. This research has been accused of being nationalist in nature, but it's in a kind of an interesting kind of, I guess, I think the Bosnian pyramid maybe is maybe a good comparison, because it's not necessarily in a way we would expect, right? Archaeology and nationalism, archaeology as propaganda is as old as the science itself, right?
As old as the hills that people think are pyramids. Yeah,
exactly. Right? and nations have attempted to leverage archaeological narratives to make claims to all sorts of things, and in wartime and peacetime and on, right? So looking at this through that lens is it's not hard to recognize that that's certainly possible.
Mm.
The murmurings that I have heard is that there's a possibility that the Indonesian government would like to see this as a tourist destination and a possible moneymaker. And again, another murmuring I've heard is that, well, some of the authors are quite close friends with powerful political figures within the Indonesian government. But how do you fact check that? I certainly don't have a way to do that. But there have been, again, this is, we take this with a grain of salt, that these are accusations that have been made, and I haven't yet seen obvious evidence that that's the case of what's happening here.
But in the case of the Bosnian situation, though, the nationalist angle is that way before anyone else was building pyramids, we in Bosnia were building pyramids, even though even the concept of Bosnia didn't exist at the time. So again, you can see why it becomes compelling to different nations and different groups of people. What are your thoughts on the peer review situation, Andy?
Well, two things. I mean, first of all, I think we should emphasise that I'm sure the authors of the paper and Wiley would deny that anything untoward went on.
Yeah.
This has gone through an entirely legitimate academic editorial process. But at the same time, as Bill said, I think everybody pretty much in the sector now, I think, acknowledges there are issues with journals, there are issues with peer review, there are issues with, for example, I've covered cases where university press offices have put out a press release about something because basically it's clickbait. It attracts headlines not just in academic journals and in academic social media, but actually in the mainstream media, and this certainly has. It's done its job, and sometimes that is entirely ethical and proper, and the claims are legitimate. Other times, I've certainly covered cases where things have been overclaimed. And so I think just because something is in a journal of record doesn't mean you don't you leave your you leave the suspension of disbelief at the door. You still have to check your sources. You still have to read it closely and ask, are the questions and are the answers legit? I think the other thing about this as well is, and one of the things that I find really interesting about it is, as you read it, a measured scientific paper that quotes a lot. It quotes 3 or 4 major professional geophysical remote prospecting methods that they throw at this particular issue, and it quotes the equipment and it quotes the methodologies and you've got the graphics and so on. So on the surface, you've got something that looks entirely convincing. It's when people started to look beneath that scientific veneer that the questions started to be asked, and at the time of recording haven't really been answered.
I think that's a really important point, because I think there is an avenue by which this has gotten through peer review in a way that is not nefarious on the part of editors or reviewers, right? That I could see an avenue, because you're absolutely right, Andy, that the paper does a good job of it's quite badly written in some ways. It's very hard to read, but it does do the things you're supposed to do, right? It explains the methods very intimately. It even talks about shortcomings, and it talks about, here's places where our radiocarbon dates might have been exposed to something that might have thrown them off. Like it's measured all the way up until the end, and then it hits you with this conclusion about this buried pyramid. And we were talking a little bit earlier about some of the problems with the peer review process, and one of them is it's actually sort of a labor issue, in that it's really hard to get people to review papers nowadays. And I edit a small journal, and even we have this problem, but bigger journals really have this problem, because their volume is high, right? They're publishing 40, 50 papers a year. They have to find 3 reviewers for each one of those. And I've heard from reviewers who have talked about it taking an average of 15 to 20 requests before you can get 3 people to agree to review a paper. And it's not because people are lazy, it's because they don't have time. Part of it has to do with the breakdown of our labor model, where it used to be that the people who did peer review were tenure track faculty members, and that which is what I am lucky enough to be, but I'm a rarity nowadays. But that's a part of my job. I can do peer review because that's part of what I get paid for, right? I can, if I tell my boss that it doesn't really work like that, but like, let's say if somebody asked me, what did you do from 10 to 12 on this Tuesday? And I could say, oh, I was peer reviewing a journal article. That would be perfectly acceptable use of my time for my job. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you're, say, a CRM archaeologist, a cultural resource management archaeologist working for a private firm who has great expertise and would probably be a great reviewer, nobody pays you to do that, and you're already overworked and you just can't do it, right? So it's possible that they had to go so deep in the barrel to find reviewers for this paper that they might have been people who couldn't recognize the problems with it, right? They probably could have looked at it and said, yeah, they've used the right methods, they've been measured, I know what geoprospecting is, I know what this looks like, but they don't know the context to know what's going on here with all of this, these deeper issues. So yeah, I think that's possible that might have happened. But the last thing I'll say, I know I've been talking for a couple minutes here, but you also mentioned the clickbait model thing. And I've criticized on my channel a couple of times Nature, right? The journal of record, right? The Nature is one of the biggest journals in the world and really well respected. They've been criticized in recent years of following like a clickbait model, and they have published some papers that were very controversial, and some of them have even been retracted in the years since. Maybe the best examples are perhaps I talked about on a video about the Cerruti Mastodon site, which I think is actually a more complex site than the one we're talking about here. I think that's genuinely got some complexities about what's real and what's not. But they also published a bunch of these, Sodom and Gomorrah destroyed by meteors kind of papers. And those papers have been pretty much disproven, and they've had to retract some of them. Or the ultimate, going back, this isn't archaeology, but, the whole anti-vax movement in some ways got its start with a bad journal article that was totally fraudulent. That a prestigious journal published anyway, and then had to retract years later. And to this day, this is why I think it was, I can't remember if it was Andy or Marc who said it earlier. We're going to be hearing about this paper in 25 years, even if it does get retracted, because people still point that paper and say, I can't take a vaccine. Look, this doctor told me it would give me autism. And it's like, well, that paper's been retracted and was found to be totally fraudulent. That guy
for anyone that wants to look it up, it's the case of he was actually struck off, so he's no longer Dr. Andrew Wakefield, but it was linking the triple MMR vaccine with autism, which was disproven fairly quickly, but as you say, it really kickstarted the whole anti-vax movement certainly in the Northern Hemisphere.
And also, nobody cares that it was retracted years later, right? The people who use it as a case, right? So
absolutely, and there were disciplinary processes and all sorts of things that flowed from it.
Also, there's a great Facebook page called Retraction Watch, where it's fantastic. Some of it is genuine, like kind of funny. Other parts, actually, it's really good to know what has been retracted and why. So I'd also recommend that to folks at home.
Can I just pick up a point about the language? You mentioned the writing, Bill, and it's a personal experience, but I hope it's applicable here. And that's that. Obviously, we're talking about a journal written or published in English, and it is likely, possibly even probable, that many, if not all, the authors are using English as a second language. And I've, in the past, peer review is one thing, and you review a paper and so on. I remember I've not done a huge amount of peer reviewing, but I was once asked to peer review an article by somebody using their second language. Using it written in English by somebody using their second language. And my role there as a peer reviewer, because working with the editor, I was willing to do it. There wasn't a budget for a translator. So, in fact, what I did with the author and with the editor's permission was effectively turn it into readable English. And, whether that is possible, desirable, that's a discussion for another day. But again, I think it's something people need to realise about academic papers. And again, who knows, with things like ChatGPT coming along and so on, how that might change in the future. But certainly, there are issues around academic writing and intelligibility anyway, and particularly for even a a specialist committed reader, but one without the direct knowledge of the field but an interest in it. And I think the more esoteric scientific end of geophysics is one of those things. As an archaeologist, I use geophysics. I don't pretend. It's like driving a car. I know what it delivers for me. I don't have to know how it works all the time. And so I think we need to bear those sorts of things in mind when we're reading this stuff.
Well, but I suppose the flip side of that is that we are, however, sensitive to those things that are significant, and it just in the same way that there's a semiotic barrier. Yeah, you don't necessarily know what exactly significant about the Jackson Pollock-esque results of a raw geophysical survey. You do know when you're handed those results and when they're interpreted for you, and when someone helps you to see them, what constitutes a significant result in terms of things like occupation layers or artifacts or signs of human or domestication or some other anthropologically in significant moment in that data. So yes, I mean, there will be aspects of that, but also at the same time, it doesn't feel as though this research is catering specifically to actually proving that people did something. Material has been dated. That's absolutely true. Void has been found. Fantastic. But there are a great many voids with organic material to be found within them across this world where no person has set foot yet. So it's all something to be aware of. But I find it fascinating how well, it's not even fascinating. It's not even that surprising. Again, given that the TV series Ancient Apocalypse was already rehashing some work that he had been doing since the 80s, 90s, and so on and so forth. The actual presentation of the data within that show, I believe, references carbon dating, and also references dating of stone as well, as this paper does. And so again, it's not. If he really wanted to be, if people really wanted this to be a redemption moment or a vindication moment for Hancock, then it had to be beyond a doubt connected to human occupation, and it's just not clear.
I think some of the keys in this are to do with the language. The language was really interesting in this paper. I think I probably thought about that more than anything else as I was reading about it, and then coming up with an outline of what I wanted to say. And I spend a lot of time talking about that in the things I've written and said about this. Is I think it's whether or not the paper was written as somebody was writing in a second language. I don't think that part is too much of a problem. The paper it's really, really difficult to read for a public audience, as you were saying, because it's very jargon filled, super duper jargon filled, and it's very, very not approachable for a public audience. But in other ways, it seems like some of the language was aimed at the same audience who might watch something like an Ancient Apocalypse, and in a couple of different ways. One, it uses a lot of persuasive language. So this could be a translation thing, maybe, but it uses a lot of words like when they're describing their methods, they say, we did this meticulously, or we did this, I don't know, little things like that normally you wouldn't see in a scientific paper that seem like they're trying to persuade you that their methods were good instead of just telling you what their methods were and letting you decide for yourself as a person reading the article.
Also, lots of words like pioneering, breaking new ground. Y'all aren't ready for what we've achieved here, folks. That kind of thing.
Which is, it's a weird framing device for an academic paper, but it is the framing device of an Ancient Apocalypse type show. And then the second place where you see this is really in the figures. We haven't talked about the figures that much. Some of the figures are fine. They're just the GPR surveys or whatever. But some of them they remind me a lot of the like Facebook pseudo-archaeology page things with the red circles all over them and words with question marks and arrows pointing in random directions. They're very, very difficult to discern what's happening in these figures. And I think they're meant to sort of overload the senses and communicate to you again the same things that those are. This looks like that kind of inference. These inferences that rely on a jump of logic without the the in-between, which is, I think, supposed to sort of prime you to accept their jump in logic, the big jump in logic at the end, that they in fact have found a buried pyramid that's 20,000 years old, which they clearly have not, based on the evidence, but they're going to tell you very persuasively that they have. So it is an interesting merge of something that's really, really not meant for the public. Clearly, this was meant to get through peer review, but also meant for the public, I think, in the sense that it's framed and presented in a way that's more reminiscent of something you might see on a Netflix television show or something than in a typical scientific journal article. So I don't know. It's complicated. It's complicated.
Well, I suppose in that sense, the idea of sort of guiding your eye towards. So, I mean, you say Facebook groups. Obviously, there's also been a huge trend in the past 5 years on YouTube to have thumbnails with circles and arrows and that kind of thing. And so, yes, I can see a little bit of that happening here. But also, I suppose what it enables is it's the implication that if you don't understand what we're saying here, that's because you need to go back and look harder, because we've made it very clear for you in these diagrams. Now you need to go and read this again properly, that kind of thing. There is that. I suppose to flip that on its head, I was always taught that good academic writing shouldn't rely on jargon. If you can't within your paper basically describe to someone with some knowledge of what the subject area is, what you're talking about, then you probably need to go away and work on it again. And in this instance, there seems to be a certain wall of data and acronyms and reference points that, it leads me to the inevitable question of presumably, should we presume that the people who did peer review on this knew what they were looking at? Can that be guaranteed? Do we know?
I think it's we have to work backwards with the evidence that we have, right? But the fact that if the only thing we know is that this paper did successfully get through peer review, and it's very clear that it has a lot of problems in a lot of ways. So if you would think somebody who had a lot of background in geology or geoarchaeology or archaeological prospection would see the methodological issues that we've talked about and many others have criticized, but those seem to have gotten through somehow. You'd think somebody with a broader perspective on the world of archaeology might look at this and recognize the issues with this, the nationalist issues and the touristic issues and the Graham Hancock connection, and raise red flags around that. Not necessarily, that would mean that it shouldn't get published, but I don't know, maybe it does. Maybe that does mean that, or maybe we should at least question that. But normally when you pick peer reviewers, you try and get people who can speak to different aspects of the paper, and there's usually at least three. So did they just totally miss all of that? And then just anybody with a mind, any scientist, right? Anybody who understands the logical method of the scientific method could recognize the logical gap and fallacy of these conclusions as related to this data. Like, I don't think you need to even be an archaeologist at all necessarily to see that. Although perhaps, like you were saying, Marc, this kind of wall of text is meant to overwhelm the senses and make you more likely to do that.
Well, and feel very legit. Yeah.
It makes it feel, it does. It lends credibility, right? And there's an irony there, because we get accused all the time as archaeologists of being hoity-toity academics who we just are jealous of guys like Hancock because we don't know how to talk to the public and people think we're boring or something. But this paper is, wow. I've said once or twice on Twitter or something that in my opinion, I actually think that this paper probably should have been desk rejected. So I don't, and it shouldn't have gotten past the editor in the first place. And philosophically speaking, I think that should be saved for really rare instances, right? I think peer review should do its job, and there are times when the editor maybe thinks something isn't good, and they need to get those second opinions from experts. The editor should not take that strong of a hand in making decisions. But the role of the desk rejection for an editor, and a desk rejection just means the editor doesn't even send it out for peer review. They just say, no, this is rejected. We're not going to take this paper. We're not going to publish this paper. The place for that is when the paper is not in good faith, or fraudulent or connected with something unsavory or something like that.
Just to sort of cover ourselves there in terms of allegedly, like in that sense, we can't guarantee that any of those words necessarily apply to this paper. But hypothetically, with a paper, is that a measure of risk, do you think, that the editor ultimately cares about the reputation of the journal? And at that point, with that sort of decision, it's a case of, well, actually, on balance, this isn't worth taking the risk on this paper.
I think that's a great question. Should the editor sort of consider that the reputation of the journal? And I probably not, right? In the same way that we wouldn't want an editor to choose to push through a paper because it's clickbait, because they think it will lead to more citations or more press attention for your journal. I think maybe in the other way, we'd like our editors to be as unbiased as possible, right? That also maybe an editor should be willing to allow a controversial paper to go through the peer review process and be published if it warrants it, if it's worthy of publication, as far as the peer reviewers argue, to up to a certain extent, right? I mean, this is a hot button sort of a ticket question, right? Of kind of a free speech question and free education, right? Because journals have been criticized in recent years for publishing papers that were controversial, even if they didn't necessarily have any flaws in their methodology and that sort of thing. And I, I don't know if I'm ready to take a position on that. I guess whether journal editors should ever use that power to push out away a paper simply because it's controversial. I think this paper has, and I agree, we should be using the term allegedly here because we don't know this stuff for sure, but it's got big enough. I think it could have been desk rejected simply on the fact that it has fundamental flaws in its scientific reasoning that are so great that it just isn't worthy of publishing. And then that other stuff is extra. And I can understand how an editor could be in a difficult situation where they, how would they know, right? They don't know for sure. We don't know for sure what role, Graham Hancock or the Indonesian government played in this paper. We have no idea, right? It's all based on evidence and supposition. So that was a rambling answer, but those are huge, really hard questions to tackle. And this paper is a kind of a powerful case study to think about those things. So it's not surprising that it's struck up a lot of this sort of conversation.
I suppose before we sort of start to wrap this up, one question that I need to ask, probably on behalf of potentially some viewers out there, and that is, are we just primed to not like this paper? Is there a possibility that because of especially key figures who are thanked in at the bottom of the paper and so on and so forth, and also the fact that this research was pre-published effectively, certainly pre-publicized on a Netflix TV series, are we just primed to dismiss it? I think that's worth asking, I think.
I do think we need to make sure we're checking our biases on that. And I think that's important, right? Like, I think that is important because this paper could have been perfect. And I think maybe some archaeologists would have jumped on it and said, no, this is crap because of those very reasons, right?
Yeah.
Because of its connection to Hancock. And I can say for myself that I actually didn't realize that Hancock was in the acknowledgments till I got to that part of the paper, which is of course the very end of the paper. And I was like, what? That's sort of shocking. But I did know about, obviously, its that this research was a part of Ancient Apocalypse. So of course I knew about that connection. And there's no way to know for sure whether you can completely expunge that bias. But I know that I certainly went into this with the mindset that I want to judge this paper on its own merits. I also was pre-biased by the fact that I had seen other people criticizing the paper from those perspectives. So I'd already seen geologists and geoarchaeologists saying, there's real problems with these methods. I think these cores are not good. I had already so there were all kinds of biases that I had going in to sit down and read the paper, but that is true no matter what. There's no way to avoid that. You can never be totally unbiased. So the only thing you can do is try and go into it really good faith. And so I know for myself, at least, I sat down and said, I'm going to try and read this paper and it's just in the best faith that I can and try and assess it on its own merits, which is why I don't really talk about, like in my video, a lot about the whole like Graham Hancock connection, because I just don't think you need to. I think, or if that's even all that important of a way to criticize this paper. It can simply be criticized on the sort of science and the basis of its scientific merit.
Does it do a good job of doing what it's there to do, and that is to convince you?
Yeah, and I don't think it does. I think it doesn't make a very strong argument at all. So
I'd like to broaden the discussion out a little bit, really, to bring in that second article from Archaeological Prospection, which I referenced earlier. That's the Wadsworth, Hamhofer, and Supernant article. They're three scholars from the Institute of Prairie and Indigenous Archaeology at the University of Alberta. So they're writing from a Canadian point of view. And they are talking in a way that I think suggests that editors of these magazines, these journals, and archaeologists in general actually really should be aware of these issues. And perhaps I can feed in some personal experience from 10 years ago, which suggests that people should be aware of these issues. But basically what the article by those three scholars talks about is the way that archaeological prospection is now much more visible in both scientific literature, but also Marc mentioned Time Team earlier, but popular archaeology programs. Very few archaeology programs these days don't have some element of geophysics.
Geophys,
yeah. I mean, exactly. Time Team gave the world that whole a new word. A lot of geophysicists, I think, might bridle at that. But anyway, that's where we are. And what the use of these scientific methods does is, certainly for a popular audience who maybe are interested but less aware of the limitations, it gives an additional strength and reality to the conclusions. And if they're badly presented, or as the article talks about, presented in a way that is deliberately misleading in certain circumstances, then you end up again with the false story out there before the archaeologists even got their steel toe cap boots on, let alone got the trowel out. And I mean, they talk about, in particular, as well as the Graham Hancock examples, they also talk about what called IRS in Canada, Indian residential schools. People might remember the recent cases of alleged unmarked burials and mass graves in what were described as Indian residential schools, where the children of native people, Indigenous people in Canada, were taken off to boarding schools and sometimes never came home. And sometimes their families weren't even told that they died.
No,
certainly not how and why and where they were buried. And people need to read the article, and so I won't try and paraphrase it too much, but they do point out, for example, the use for what's called denialism by the far right in Canada, where they point out ambiguities between the geophysics and what was claimed for the geophysics on these sites and what was actually recovered, and so on, as a way of saying that these cases were either overstated or never took place at all.
Well, what they appear to identify is a duality. So you have the ambiguity of the academic acting in good faith, hopefully, combined with, they say here in quotes, the certainty of the fringe communication that then uses it. And that they say can both be used to the detriment of Indigenous and other descendant communities in various ways.
That's exactly the point. And they make the point that, for example, any of us as archaeologists doing this kind of work, particularly in those kind of sensitive circumstances where identity and place and all the things actually we've talked about in as possibly having a bearing on the Indonesian example, on Gunung Padang, occurring here in a Canadian situation. But the idea that as archaeologists we must be acutely sensitive to the cultural setting of where we're doing the work, and that we don't just parachute in to do stuff two people and then go away again and publish it, but that we have an ongoing conversation with those communities, with those individuals, with those community organizations and representative bodies and so on, so that they have a buy-in to what's going on. And
presumably as well, where there is a question mark, ambiguity isn't enough. Then there also needs to be some sort of intellectual boundary that says, well, it's definitely not aliens. You know what I mean? So you have a limit to the question mark, so people can't come in and do what again, what's described here as pseudo-archaeological colonialism, which actually is something that we identified with Bill in our previous episode on this.
Indeed.
So on the series about the exoticism of the locations, going around the world and introducing people to places and names that they hadn't heard of, Gunung Padang being one of them, for example, one that I hadn't heard of until I saw it on this TV series, is that sort of pseudo-archaeological, at the very least, Orientalism, the mystique of the unknown, as opposed to, but colonialism is also a perfectly good word.
Very usefully, the article includes a table of what they call red flags. Now, first, I'll deal with them in slightly separately. One is in claims of human remains. They emphasise, and this is particularly important in cases like the Indian residential schools, where they stress that current geophysics can't find human remains. Now, again, I'm old enough and sad enough to remember a BBC series called Bonekickers, where in one of the episodes,
you've got to watch it, Bill. Get it on DVD.
Yes,
it's a new one to me.
So we'll send you a copy if we can find one.
Absolutely. It was a drama series on the BBC more than 10 years ago now. But in one episode, some geophysics is thrown up on the screen of a computer, and you can see the individual bones of individual skeletons. At which point, most archaeologists watching it collapsed on the floor, rolling. It was Roffelmau moment.
Yeah.
It ain't like that. It never has been. Certainly is. That's right. Yeah. Yes. So that's one red flag. It's showing more detail than actually, or implying knowledge of more detail than the techniques can actually recover.
Yeah, which we see here.
But the other two I take together, and it's the other two red flags. One, they label too good to be true, and the other one they extrapolate from incomplete data. And they talk about be wary of a too good to be true project description, quotes, and claims to survey large areas at low cost, new innovative technology, or guarantees of results. And they also talk about creating elaborate models and conclusions without supporting evidence. I think we might just have seen that with Gunung Padang. Overstating results, arguably the same, and then clear holes in the methodological research design. I just apply that to my own experience. People who are regular watchers of the Watching Brief will know that in 2012, 2013, I was the lead archaeologist on a project that was investigating the myth of buried Spitfires in Burma. The idea that British Spitfire aircraft had been buried by the Royal Air Force at the end of World War II, with the idea that they were going to be recovered at some point in the future. That claim was in large part, and it was emphasized in the media by some geophysics work, which had been commissioned before I joined the project and my colleagues joined the project, by the person who was instigating the project, a fellow called David Cundall. And what appears to have happened is that there were two lots of geophysics involved. One was by some recognized geological geophysicists, some very good geological geophysicists, using some of the techniques actually that were used in Gunung Padang, because it was about looking deeper into the ground than archaeologists normally look for things like void spaces and so on. Their work was supplemented by a private commission from an individual who was the agent for a German company who sold what they claimed was basically gold finders. And and it had all sorts of red flags about it. You know, the specifications weren't fully documented. They used proprietary software to create to image. It was described as GPR, ground penetrating radar, but in fact it appears to be more of a kind of it was more of a metal detecting type technology. The upshot of that was that the good work was overclaimed for, and the private commission was basically a fantasy. But that had but taken together, there was a sort of scientific, it's shown on the screen of a computer. We can see the boxes where the Spitfires are. That got into the media, and the whole thing went viral to the extent that David Cameron, the new UK Foreign Secretary, while he was still Prime Minister, commissioned or enabled a joint project with the government of Myanmar, which I ended up being a part of. Now, anybody who wants to look at more detail in that, quick plug, The Buried Spitfires of Burma by me, Andy Brockman, and Tracy Spate. We looked at all of this in detail, how it came about, how the media covered it, and so on. Available from all good bookshops and probably some bad ones, and it's the perfect Christmas present for the archaeologist near you. The one that hasn't got the DVD, that doesn't want the DVD of Bonekickers.
Yeah.
But basically, all these red flags. This is known. We published the report within a year of the excavation, which talked about all of this, and then we've published the book since. Hopefully, we've got a film coming out in the near future about it as well. But so there's no excuse really for people not knowing about this stuff.
Yeah.
What I think we're now much more acutely aware of is the fact that we need to be in a position to combat it. And in fact, that one of the there's a recommendation for a publication strategy in the Canadian article, which I think is a good place to perhaps begin, draw this to a conclusion. They talk about, okay, you're conducting an archaeological project, which includes, geophysics, prospection. Before you start, they recommend that you anticipate problems and find the balance, particularly when you're dealing with something controversial, like the Indian residential schools. They suggest that we recognize where individuals with vested interest, like in the case of the Indian residential schools, the Canadian far right, might institute a bad faith strategy to misinterpret the work, and how we would deal with that if it were to come about. And they say, rather than debunking, and we've been very good at that on the Watching Brief, and other colleagues have done it. Bill's done it with this particular paper, but what they recommend is that we move to a more proactive process of what they call pre-bunking. It's something that's been going on in politics for over 20 years, nearly 30 years. In the run-up to the 1997 election in Great Britain, Tony Blair's Labour Party had what they called a pre-battle unit.
Oh, a pre-battle.
Yeah, the idea that if you anticipated what the bad guys might come at you with, and you had your strategy in place so that you were in a position to comment on it straight away before their story had a chance to establish itself, or preferably you put a story out there that actually basically just knocked that story on the head. And then finally they say, but as part of that you manage and plan a reaction. So you don't just publish your stuff, you have a strategy in place to react to how your stuff is met in the public space, basically. So I think it's some really, between them, those red flags and those waymarks on a project, I think are a good point to think about and to maybe engage with as we draw a discussion on this one particular example to an end.
Yeah, I gotta jump in. Just to give an endorsement to all those ideas. I mean, these authors, first of all, are really good. So Keisha Supernat is probably one of the more important archaeologists emerging in North American archaeology right now. She's an indigenous archaeology MIT archaeologist, and an expert GPR person, and I've seen her speak and stuff, and very, very powerfully and very interested not only in doing the actual work of these really important work on residential schools, but also in speaking on the power of that and how that can be done collaboratively with descending communities and all that stuff. And Steph Helmhofer actually is an archaeologist that specializes in pseudo-archaeology, specifically in the politics of archaeology and studies like the archaeology of cults and things like that. Actually really fascinating work. So check those two out if you want. But I think it raises this point about, I love this idea of doing the pre-buttal or pre-thinking. We have to get out of this mindset as scientists that we are somehow like working in some high realm outside the bounds of politics, and because we're clearly not, right? Our work is being used to construct and strengthen narratives, sometimes ones that you really didn't intend when you were or would expect when you're writing. So this idea of just being active in that, I do think this is a bigger project than just archaeology. It's going to probably rely on us to find connections with the rest of the scientific community, because there is, I think this article was a great example of the current failure in the model of science journalism, because a number of, Vice was the biggest one I saw, but a number of media outlets just covered this article with complete credulity. Like, oh yeah, wow, oldest pyramid in the world. And that was the headline: 20,000-year-old pyramid in Indonesia, 4 times older than the Egyptian pyramids, whatever it was. It was just that those were the headlines instantly, and without any thought or checking. And I think some of this has to do with some of the things you were mentioning, Andy, that are really important. This kind of STEM bias that exists in the popular consciousness, that when archaeology is discarded, it's often because people think, well, we're just like social scientists, we're part of the humanities, what do we really know? I can't tell you how many times I've had people, archaeology is just guesswork. It's like, okay, then all science is, right? But so this idea that if you have a fancy $100,000 machine and that produces computer images that look like a bunch of symbols and buttons, and you draw squares over the top of that, people will believe it because they go, that's science, right? That's geology, that's chemistry, that's the hard, real stuff, right? And you just need to be super aware of that when you put your research out there, that you need to be quite explicit about what those images do or don't say, because they will be interpreted in bad faith, or just because out of ignorance, people don't, they just assume that that's what it says. So yeah, read this paper. I haven't had a chance to read it yet because this paper just came out like a couple of days ago, and it's in the same journal, which is yeah. So it's like there's something cosmically harmonious about that. That in the next, I don't know if it's in the same issue. Is it one issue later? I'm not sure, but it's in the same exact peer review journal. Then they must have been going through peer review simultaneously, but for those who don't know, articles often take at least a year to get published from the time they're done, at least, and it's much longer.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, looking at the header, that's the Wadsworth et al. Article. It appears to have been turned around really quickly in these terms. If you look at the header on the published online version, it was received on the 10th of February 2023. So, 9 months ago, basically. The revisions were in by the 2nd of May. And the article was accepted for publication on the 13th of October.
It's actually on almost the same track. I'm looking at the original article, the one we've been criticizing to some extent. That was received in 14th of December 22, and then revised in July of 23, and then accepted in September of 23. So they were really running pretty parallel.
Yeah, interesting.
Right?
And in fact, I think I'm right in saying that on in her I think it was on Blue Sky, Stephanie Helmhofer suggested that the publisher, which is Wiley, one of the suggestions was that they did less material on Gunung Padang.
Okay, interesting. Yeah. So okay, all very relevant. But I suppose brief, broader observation about communication that I'd like to just invite people to consider and maybe read about below. Earlier this week, I shared an article on various social media platforms that was actually published on November the 8th this year on phys.org, and it's an article with the headline "Cultural Artifacts Serve as Cognitive Fossils, Helping Uncover the Psychology of the Past." And in particular, this is drawing on research that was published in Trends in Cognitive Sciences, where they used modern computing methods like text mining, face detection algorithms, and melodic extraction programs to enable large-scale analysis of cultural artifacts such as paintings, stories, or clothing to uncover psychological data as to the culture that they've come from. Now, what was interesting is when I shared this article on, for example, the Archaeologists Facebook page, people who have an interest in archaeology are like, well, yeah, we already know this. We've been doing this for decades at this point. You know, it's not just about, I think, communicating with the public. It's also cross communication between different research groups and professions or disciplines. Another really key example that I think was really opened my eyes up to this years ago was actually the work of Stephen Mython, when he was looking at the evolution of the human brain. He came up with the idea of cathedral mind as a metaphor for how the brain was developed over time, with the bits being built onto it and plugged onto it. And in the opening to that book, but also in papers that he published prior to writing the book, he actually was quite critical of his colleagues, fellow archaeologists and anthropologists, for not reaching out to that resource of neuroscience when we've spent the better part of 100 years analysing fossils of our own species, but also our ancestor species, trying to understand how we came about. And yet right there, in terms of the cranial cavity, the missing part, supposedly, for many evolutionary anthropologists, was a resource in the form of neuroscience. Now, obviously, that's improved greatly, not least with people like Mython pointing to that as a resource. But this, I do sometimes, I don't know about you guys, but I sometimes worry that individual academics, and to a certain extent myself included, for example, my biggest piece of writing was on cross-pollination of psychology, social theory, archaeology, and some other bits and bobs. The extent to which people are actually doubling up on ideas and sort of reinventing the wheel without necessarily knowing it. The problem is you can't negate anyone's research on this, but maybe if there was a better way of having a sort of a cross-referencing, I suppose, between research interests, that might be helpful. I mean, did you ever bump into that when you're researching and writing, Bill?
Yeah, I mean, I think an increase in interdisciplinary work is just generally good, but it's funny. I'll use this just the last 30 seconds as my case study. As soon as you started describing that work, my mind immediately went to, oh, that sounds like some evolutionary psychology, Jordan Peterson shit right there, right? Like, so like my biases were like instantly, right? And so some of it is we all think that our discipline does it the best, right? And people get a little bit territorial. So it's psychologists start talking about ancient humans. I say, hey, get out of my backyard. What do you know about this? And that's probably counterproductive to learning from each other. And one of the reasons that sometimes these disciplines can sound so discordant to one another is maybe because they're unwilling to talk to each other, right? And that you can actually find. So yeah, I think a move towards and going back to some of the points we made earlier with these communication issues, like pointed out in the second paper we were discussing, right? How do we fight misconceptions about science or bad faith actors presenting scientific data in, say, popular journalism, trying to do that as individual disciplines? We just don't have the power to do that. So anything we can do to forge bonds with other scholars in other disciplines and people outside of the scholarly community who are trying to do good work and good thoughtful work is good, right? We have to build a coalition, I think, because we're fighting against very large social forces.
I'd absolutely endorse that. It's something put it this way. I mentioned the Burma project just now, and one of the things that I certainly did during that was I read more papers about memory and how memory works and false memory and suggestion and so on from the psychologist community than I ever thought I would or would need to as an archaeologist. But that was with a very specific research aim in mind. But it was necessary knowledge because we couldn't have done the project without that kind of input. I would just also like to say just quickly. I mentioned Steph Holmhofer and a comment about the Gunung Padang in reference to the Canadian paper. What she actually said was, and I'm quoting here, "Our new article is published on open access," but then she added a note. Quick note, we did originally have a longer, more specific section about Gunung Padang, but reviews wanted it shortened to make room for other discussions. She doesn't elaborate on that, but I think that's quite interesting in the context of what's actually gone on.
Yeah, and at the same time in the same journal. Yeah, I suppose just one final remark about that notion of cross-pollination. It's interesting that, again, it sort of goes back to what we were talking about a little bit earlier in terms of semiotics and the extent to which you respect the authenticity or even just the look of data based on how much it appeals to your way of thinking. So in this instance, we have data scientists looking at cultural artifacts and going, well, because the computer says this, this, and this, it must be statistically significant. Whereas the very discipline of semiotics is something which isn't something that a computer could do, I don't think, still just yet, or maybe it is just about able to start doing it, and hence this paper. But it is something that it's a type of evidence, a type of discussion, a type of publishing that clearly hasn't crossed their desk before. And so, I mean, you were just saying, Bill, how initially in comes the bias of that sounds a bit like so and so, but it's because maybe we're all just accustomed to how. I suppose there's the academic culture of how data is presented, but also maybe just, there's a reason that you become an archaeologist or an anthropologist because that data appeals to you. There's a reason that you're not, a different type of analytical mind in that sense. So yeah, it's a huge question as to how on earth we get past that, and I imagine there's a nugget of that question as to how we communicate better with each other. In there somewhere is the answer as to how it is we communicate better with genuinely curious minds who are diverted by people like Hancock and co. But yeah.
I think it's something I'm always talking about. Obviously, we'll give Bill the last word on this, but as our guest. But as I've said many, many times on watching briefs, I think if I use the term storytelling, I don't mean that in a sort of pop bedtime story sort of way, but I think we, as archaeologists, if we want to communicate outside of our own cells, outside of our own echo chambers, then we need to learn to find the right language to tell good, compelling stories, even when it's about stuff that's actually quite complicated, like this kind of science. It's turning the good science into good communication, and it's a skill, and it has to be learned. It's not something that it comes naturally to many people.
No, and I guess as my sort of last word, I'll jump off that to say, I got into this sort of business here of doing this kind of archaeology and trying to speak to public audiences. Not because I had to. I certainly don't have to. I could never do this stuff and it would be totally fine. But I think it's really important, right? I think obviously everybody, here agrees that it is. That's why we're doing this sort of thing. It's really important. And people will accuse us a lot of not being able to, or that the science isn't interesting enough. It needs to be embellished. It needs to be, and that's never true, right? We've seen good. That term storytellers, right? People who can tell a good narrative, and there's a that sounds like they're making something up, but no, a storytelling is just how do you take the information and construct it into a way that communicates clearly what what the information says, right? Because the data by itself can't speak for itself. It never can. It has to be constructed into a narrative by the author and put out there for people to understand. And we absolutely can get better at that. And we can walk those two worlds, right? You can write in walk the walk of academia to make sure your paper is getting published in good journals, because you need to do that because you ultimately have to eat and pay bills. But you also, it is a really powerful skill and a useful skill as a scholar to do that. And then there's other ways that we can reach out as well. So we all interact with members of the public all the time who are really interested and that idea came before of just genuinely intellectually curious people. There's so many people who really care about this stuff. They care about the past, they care about antiquity, they care about past peoples. But it's so much easier to find a show on Netflix than it is to read a journal article in every way, both in language, but also in literal access, right? Yeah. To get a journal article, you just can't get them many times, right? How do you actually get that? So these are folks who have that drive, that intellectual curiosity, but perhaps either they came to it too late in life, or they never had the opportunity to pursue this weird career that we're in, right? Even if maybe they wanted to be, and we should never dismiss those people as somehow lesser than or crass, because they're not. They're just intellectually curious folks, and maybe their first interaction has been with not the most seemly of data and information, but we can talk to those folks and get them involved and even gather their perspectives, because sometimes they might come from a totally different walk of life than we do any given scholar or community member does, right? So just different types of these collaborations and reaching across aisles and talking to people is generally going to be good, while at the same time, like, we don't have to talk to Nazis, right? You do not have to right? Like that's not, we don't have to take this to the logical conclusion of everybody's opinions are valid. They're not. Some people have trash opinions, and it's okay to throw those out. But that's most of the time people are not in that position. And so you can give them some space to talk and listen and hear as well.
Speaking of trash opinions, Bonekickers is available for £1.26 on Amazon, so I may send you a copy. But as a preview, we can send you a link. It's also available on YouTube. I'll link below, so everyone at home can also watch episode 1 of series. Series 1 and only the series. Yes. And it's a thing, thing of beauty.
And for the Americans watching, a series is a season. Right?
Yeah.
That's this is because the series here means the whole show, all the season.
I see.
Yeah, I see. Very. I don't know why that is. This is.
But in this instance, the season is the series, and the series is the season.
In many cases, I'm just enjoying the fact that this moment seems to be the sort of living embodiment of the old joke about. I think it was George Bernard Shaw said that the British and the Americans were two cultures divided by a common language.
Do you have that A in your archaeology? Do you have your you got
artifact, the E in artifact,
artifacts.
Yeah. I remember a few years ago now, an American student, losing it with me because I spelled artifact wrong, and I was like, go away, look at your etymology, and then come back to me.
They're both fine.
They are both fine. They are absolutely fine.
I have to read 17th century documents all the time, and I can see where we got these weird things in America, because the people who are designing the English language that would get used in America did not use standardized spelling. I can tell you from experience.
No, exactly. It's fine.
I always remember when I was doing English at school many years ago, we were told that if you want to spell Shakespeare correctly, just remember you pronounce it in Italian. So it's Shakespeare. You never forget the E at the end.
Yeah. Although, sorry, we are rambling now, but there is, interestingly, there's actually an English dialect historian who performs Shakespeare as it would have been performed. And he sounds to a modern British ear like he's sort of from the back of beyond in Lancashire or something, or maybe somewhere a bit further south than that. It's a very sort of it's hard to do, but a very sort of sort of throaty, farmerish kind of accent that you wouldn't think of as being connected to the Royal Shakespeare Company. You know, yeah,
Absolutely not. No.
different world,
That
different
makes
world.
sense, right? Because Shakespeare was crass, right? That was
Yeah,
borderline pornographic, wasn't it?
yeah, shocking.
That's a whole other show. I think we should probably.
Which I found.
Yeah,
No
after hours. Yeah.
Other than having to read Shakespeare in high school, I can't give you anything.
Thank you so much for your time, Bill. Thank you. We'll hopefully talk to you again at some point. And if you guys at home have any thoughts about this conversation, please do comment below, and we'll pass on any pertinent comments to Bill if he wants to reply directly. But thank you. Cheers.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you. It was absolutely my pleasure. If you do want to find me here on the YouTubes, I'm over at Archaeology Tube, and I've got. You can watch this Gunung Padang video and other stuff too, other fun stuff on there as well. So
again, we'll definitely link below. Yeah, cool. A watching brief is a formal program of observation and investigation to record and report on notable discoveries on an archaeological site. As part of our ongoing watching brief, Andy and I work hard to bring you the best, the worst, and sometimes the more quirky happenings from the world of archaeology. We aim to provide a space where voices can be heard, opinions shared, and sometimes truth spoken to power. If you believe in the work we do, please consider supporting us on Patreon for as little as $1 per month. Thank you.
And that's our conversation. It's just occurred to me that that is probably the most appropriate sort of birthday card that we could offer the Netflix series Ancient Apocalypse, because as I said in the interview, it did premiere almost exactly a year ago.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the whole controversy is sort of growing up nicely.
Yeah,
and it's reached its first birthday, and happy birthday, Graham, and the Netflix team, and I just hope you enjoy I hope you've enjoyed the present of that particular paper.
Yeah. It's I think, as ever, this is something that we often talk about is the academic publishing industry. And as much as we touched on it in that chat with Bill, it continues to be fraught with some problems, I think. Not least the fact that some journals really have a stranglehold on notions of credibility and also the terms of publication, but also as well in this instance, there are questions at journals as to how it is that they manage the reliability of what they publish. Because one of the, in that sense, it's all well and good knowing that because basically, you're on a winning ticket if you're running a journal. People need to submit papers because that's their job, and if you have space to publish, then you can sort of, if not, I mean, so in some instances, ask them to pay you to put stuff into your journal. But surely to goodness, there has to be a balance there in terms of responsibility to make sure that the quality of your journal is high, and that everyone's research is being published on a plane that is of equal quality. It is interesting though that we did see that other article about quality and about how people talk about, especially for example, Indonesian heritage in this instance, yes, coming through that pipeline at the same time in the same journal. Do you think they must have been aware of it, the editor?
We don't know, do we? And that's part of the problem. You can't FOI a commercial academic publisher.
No.
So unless somebody leaks something, and we'd be very happy to see the internal correspondence about that if anyone would care to send it to us. Mm-hmm. Or any other story that you want us to investigate. But no, in all seriousness, I think there's a couple of problems here, aren't there? One is that while, again, we have to emphasize there is no evidence that anything untoward happened in the submission, editorial process and publication of this article.
No.
It appears to, we have no evidence that it was produced in anything other than good faith. Mm-hmm. and there's no reason, it's not a conspiracy organised by Graham Hancock,
Nope.
Although he is mentioned, as Bill said, in the acknowledgements to the paper, which I think was a bit of a jaw dropper for a lot of archaeologists reading it.
Mm-hmm.
But we have to assume that in a journal of record, it's all done with due process in good faith.
Mm.
Having said that, there is a problem in that a paper that is clearly so open to criticism as this one made it not just to peer review but to actual publication. And put it this way, it now appears to be undergoing peer review from professional geophysicists, and it's not coming out well.
No. Yeah.
And a very public peer review, and one which is actually quite humiliating for the magazine, for the journal. But the other point about it, I think, is that we talk very often about, and we complain that journalists,
We complain.
in particular, can I just finish the point?
So
Marc?
go on. Yeah.
No, we complain, often rightly, sometimes not always fairly, that many journalists and general writers don't go to archaeologists, don't look at archaeological publications when they're writing about, the latest site that is the Stonehenge of the fill in the blank, etc. Here we've got a paper that is addressing an archaeological issue, and crucially, it's on open access, and we cry out for open access. One of the things I've been crying out for years is that, of course, somebody, a TV researcher, isn't going to quote an archaeological paper if they have to pay, $30 to read it, and it might not even be relevant. So we're our own worst enemy in that respect. But then you get something like this that comes along on open access, and if the people doing that public peer review, those professional geophysicists and archaeologists who criticise this paper very heavily, are right, this is just bad information out there, and it'll only get perpetuated again the next time somebody wants to write about Graham Hancock and Graham Hancock's theories.
So, in other words, more open access, because otherwise it's just going to be stuff like this that people find. Yeah,
that's the danger. Yeah.
Well, folks, Watching Brief is open access. But it also takes time and money and effort to produce. Please do consider supporting us again on Patreon. Also, do take note of our Watching Brief pin badge collection. In the very near future, as Andy recently hinted at the end of one of our episodes, we have another pin badge that's coming to that collection, along with other interesting things.
In time for Christmas.
Hopefully. Yeah. Oh, wow. In time for Christmas. We've got a lot of work to do. Anyway, take a look, check it out. Consider maybe getting some Christmas presents early, some stocking fillers that will very much help support this ongoing show. With that in mind, do take care until next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.